Good evening and welcome to this dialogue on Politic Shock by Lord Meghnad Desai. He looks at Modi, Trump, Brexit and liberal democracy. All of these hugely important at this time. Joining me along with Lord Meghnad Desai is Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I'm also joined by Swapan Dasgupta, Dr. Sanjaya Baru and Manish Tiwari. Thank you all very much for being on this panel this evening. And Lord Desai, Politic Shock, that's an interesting word, and it sums up in a sense the impact which Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have had in very different ways on their two countries.
Indeed. The shock is basically almost global. The things have been happening in the last 2-3 years, which were so out of expectations of people that there are agonized discussions, at least where I spend most of my time in London, that whether the liberal order is under threat. Is the world changing so much that we will not see the good old days again? And that all started, of course, with Brexit for the British. And then, of course, Trump happened. And when Trump was campaigning, I made the comparison between Trump and Modi. I said the way Trump is being treated in the media was exactly the way Modi was treated in the media. It was underestimated. People thought, where did this man come from? Get him out of here. This is not a respectable place. This is not a place for a person like him. And against all the expectations, they both won. And so this is against the expectation of the established order. And I wanted to explore whether this is a fundamental change in the politics of the world, or is it just a passing sort of fancy? And this is the discussion on which the book is based.
It's an interesting hypothesis you've done in the book. But let me ask Swapan Dasgupta, because though those comparisons have been made by Lord Meghnad Desai and other commentators as well, actually I find them completely dissimilar. What do you think about the whole Prime Minister Modi, President Trump comparison?
Well, but before coming to that, what I find very interesting is it's got Trump, Modi, and Brexit as the three sort of trinity. What's interesting about it, from my personal point of view, that I only had the vote in one of them. But had I had the vote in all the others, I would have voted for Trump and Brexit as well. So
that's because you're an Anglophile, Swapan, now.
Well, I didn't know if Trump is an Anglophile. He does have a
the Brexit
golf course somewhere in Scotland. But no, I think what Meghnad said is quite interesting, because what Meghnad said, it was against all expectations. I think that's really the operative term here. And in a sense, he was trying to compare it to 1914, where Sir Edward Grey said, the lights are going out all over Europe and we'll never see them again in our lifetime. Certainly, it was against the expectations of a certain group of people who were prone to believing that there is something called a consensus. And that consensus should operate all the time. And that regardless of which way you vote, it's really a choice between Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. And there can be no fundamental shift from that. What we saw in all of these cases was that there was a break. Now, there are similarities. Meghnad has called Modi an outsider. I don't think Modi was he was an outsider to Lutyens' Delhi. He was not an outsider to the political system. He was chief minister for 13 years. Now, it's someone else's fault that, if you don't regard a chief minister as being important. Trump, on the other hand, had no experience in politics. Brexit, on the other hand, was by and large canvassed. The people who favored Brexit were by and large pretty marginal to the political system. So there is an element in which they are similar, but they are dissimilar. But where they are all together is that they shake what Meghnad has called the liberal order. They shake that consensus. Whether they are all going to lead to something common is, however, disputed.
In fact,
because I think they have very different outcomes.
In fact, Shashi Tharoor, if I can bring you in the book, Meghnad Desai refers often to the hegemony of the liberal order. And I think you still pride yourself in a time when you're often attacked, where liberal is often a dirty word today in Indian politics. You still pride yourself as being a liberal politician. This hegemony of the liberal order, the whole fact that, in a sense, Prime Minister Modi seems to have completely overturned that hegemony, defining a new order, the beginning of a new India. That's a constant political theme now. How would you still stand up for the LO, as Meghnad Desai puts it?
Well, I think Meghnad is talking about the global system, really. And there, when he speaks of the liberal order, I think he's really talking about, though he oddly in one place dates it only 50 years, he's really talking about the consensus established after the Second World War, which is essentially what went on till about the financial crisis at the end of the first decade of this century. And in all fairness to Meghnad, again, he doesn't stretch the Trump-Modi comparison too far either. Because, for example, he makes the interesting observation that Trump is a populist and Modi is not, which I think is a distinction that we don't draw sufficiently. But even though I'm seated to the right of Swapan here, obviously I didn't vote the way he did in one of the three votes, and the other two, I was quite critical of the choices they represented.
Seating, no problem, straight away.
That's right. I mean, I find myself as
always on the losing
side in this, not always, but in this particular trinity, which gives me the opportunity to look at Meghnad's somewhat surprising celebration of all these developments. Surprising in the sense that.
And as a Labour peer, so I have to say that's also interesting.
Well, at least his journey from left to right hasn't been as rapid a descent as Swapan, so, there's some consolation. But nonetheless...
You're saying descent, Swapan is saying ascent.
A liberal...
But let me just finish answering your question, and then they can take their pot shots. I think he's a bit too kind to both of them, but the argument is not about whether one's an outsider or not, whatever, because that is there, and it's, in a sense...
right.
The element of surprise is now over and digested. Nobody expected any of these three outcomes, except the Modi outcome by 2014. April was probably more or less foreseen, but the other two were completely unexpected until they happened. And once they've happened, you get used to them and you move on. The question is, what are the implications for world order? And as far as my own liberalism is concerned, the Indian context, I remain very staunchly liberal, and I believe that, in fact, the liberal fight needs to be fought all the more when there is so much illiberalism that is being actively encouraged, if not condoned, condoned if not encouraged by the government. Now, I do want to say that the global scale as well, the retreat of liberalism is exaggerated. And I think Meghnad too is guilty of exaggerating it somewhat. We are going through a phase, but don't forget that even in the US, Mr. Trump got 3 million votes less than his opponent. That there are two kinds of backlash that are taking place, and I think Meghnad doesn't separate them enough in the book. There is the backlash against economic globalization, where the feeling was there were too few winners and too many losers, and the losers voted in a particular way to reject all of this. And there's a cultural backlash, which is also taking place in the name of authenticity and nationalism and often ethnic and religious fervor, against cosmopolitanism, against the global cultural elite, as much as against the Goldman Sachs elite that Hillary Clinton was seen as representing. Now, those two don't necessarily overlap. Narendra Modi and, say, President Erdogan in Turkey want to be Davos man, whereas people like Trump are explicitly running against Davos man. So there is a difference there, and that's why the comparison falls short. But what's important, I think, for all of us to recognize is this is only a phase. It hasn't fully played itself out. I think globalization and the liberal order are perfectly capable of restructuring themselves and reasserting a new way, because we can't roll back much of what's already happened in the liberal order.
Well, let me bring in Dr. Sanjaya Baru, who of course has had an interesting transition as well from the UPA government to now Secretary General of FICCI, and a very different government at this time. Dr. Baru, when you look at transitions, or when we look at this phase, as Shashi is pointing it out, as this kind of backlash perhaps against the word liberal or the politics as was practiced in the UPA time, what do you think is the biggest change, or what have you seen as the biggest change in these last years or in the Modi years?
Well, Sonia, before I answer your question, let me first pay tribute to the author.
Thank you.
Because this is a fantastic book. Reading this book, I was reminded of three gentlemen, all three of whom you have read in your professional life: Eric Hobsbawm, Nikolai Kondratiev, and Samuel Huntington.
Thank you.
And like Hobsbawm's short history of the 20th century, this book is really about the last 70 years. I go along with the view that, what is happening now, these are all transitional things. Trump got elected by a thin margin. Whether he, in fact, will survive his first term, we still don't know. So I'm not sure about Trump's election as being a historical shift. Whether 10 years from now, when again a historical survey of this sort is done, whether we would give the same weightage to what has happened in the US. But certainly, or even Brexit for that matter, I mean, one reads every day in the FT that the entire effort in Europe is to retreat from Brexit.
Wrong paper.
Wrong paper. But I think the only shift in the last 3 years, which in my view is fundamental, and that comes to your question, is the decline of the Congress party and the rise of the BJP. These are historical shifts. I agree with Shashi that one has hope for liberalism, but whether his party would be the flag bearer of that liberalism or some other party is a question mark. Because I think there's a historic decline of the Congress and a historic rise of the BJP. So what we are seeing in this country is a long-term shift. But between Brexit and Trump, I think these are all blips, which we'll have to wait and watch.
No, that's a very important point, especially when we talk about liberalism, because Manish Tiwari, who's now at the left of Dr. Baru, and of course both of you worked very closely together in the UPA years. But just to ask Manish, looking at what liberalism means, this historic verdict on triple talaq this week by the Supreme Court. Now, for a truly liberal party, surely that should have been what the Congress would have been behind. Yet we find the BJP and Prime Minister Modi strongly supporting gender justice, supporting the petition of Shaira Banu in the Supreme Court, and the Congress being extremely wishy-washy. In fact, ironically, you had Kapil Sibal, of course, in his personal capacity, representing the Muslim Personal Law Board. So what do you actually mean by liberal? That's when people accuse the Congress of being pseudo-liberal.
Well, Surya, before I come to your question, let me join Dr. Baru in congratulating Lord Meghnad Desai. It's really an excellent book. It's a survey of some very phenomenal events which have shaped global history. Yes, there are developments which I think all liberal parties need to take into consideration, and obviously there would be a recalibration of tactics, not fundamental strategy. And then coming to triple talaq, well, as you rightly said, Mr. Sibal is a lawyer, as most of us, have the right to choose our clients. But then something which is overlooked is that there was another Congress law minister who actually argued on the other side for gender justice, which was Salman Khurshid. There was somebody like me who was an intervener in that matter. So it is not as if we picked sides depending upon a particular view which the Congress party had about triple talaq. And a lot of people along the way have spoken about gender justice. Now, I don't want to turn it partisan in terms of what the motivation of the current government could be to bat for triple talaq. But be that as it may, I do not think that the last 3 years, even in India, though as Dr. Baru says that it represents the historical decline of the Congress party and the historical rise of the BJP, well, that's exactly what was predicted in 2004 when you had Shining India. The next 10 years turned out to be very different for India. So therefore, I think I would wait. I would hold my counsel till 2019. You may just see a very different India.
This is one point you picked on the book. Also, we talked about the feeling of a majority in a sense that they're in a minority, that they're being ignored for minorities. You referred to that both in President Trump's case and Prime Minister Modi's. So when we talk about liberal, and just looking at the events of this week, looking at triple talaq perhaps as an example of that inflection point we're talking about in a new polity, how do you think that actually plays out? Because you've talked also about the two surprising bits of Prime Minister Modi. One has been his focus on women's rights and also his outreach amongst weaker castes like Dalits.
Yeah, you see, my perspective, I should say, to begin with, my perspective is also very much shaped by my own political experience in the UK, that when Mrs. Thatcher happened, we thought this is madness, this cannot go on, this won't last, this is the end of civilization, she is a racist, etc. And she went on defeating us election after election after election. For a while we said, no, it was the Falklands War and so on. And then we realized, now sit down, smell the coffee, and find out why the people are voting for the party you don't like. And learn from defeat. And this is where Tony Blair comes from. Tony Blair comes from the synthesis of the old Labour beliefs, or whatever it was, and saying, but the world has changed, the whole new generation has come out, respond to what the people are saying. Here I think is the same sort of thing, that in 86, you could do Shah Banu and pass this horrendous bill, and a Muslim women's, bracket, Protection of Rights to Divorce Act, which is actually against Muslim women's rights. And it was a great triumph of secularism. 20 years on, it won't do. It won't do because women have realized that they're not going to follow this nonsense. And they have lost out from the male domination in all sides. And Muslim women especially are saying, get me out of here. Now, it just so happens that I know, as everybody thinks Modi being right-wing can't think. All left-wing people think right-wing can't think. But he has spotted the women issue way before most other people did, both in terms of outdoor defecation and things
LPG
like
subsidies,
triple talaq and LPG gas and so on. So, give the man credit. You may not like him, give the man credit. He has found something which he was not supposed to find. To convince the BJP to go after women's vote itself is an achievement. much harder work inside the party than outside the party. But see, this is
I have
where
to say
the
that,
change is.
no, and one of the political ironies was Yogi Adityanath, Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister, talking about protecting Muslim women. So I have to say the ironies of politics in India sometimes do stand up. But let me ask you, Shashi Tharoor, exactly what Lord Meghnad Desai said, that in that sense, when you talk about being a true liberal, did it ever constrain you? And you were one of the outspoken non-spokespersons of the Congress party. Did it ever constrain you that when we used to ask you, and what are your views on triple talaq, and the party had a much more cautious stand, in fact, they had no stand, and you had to take personal views. Has the Congress been on the wrong side of history on this one?
No, I don't think so. I think the real challenge the Congress party has, we don't admit it publicly, but we'll do so today. I'll do so today, since, as you know, I'm a non-spokesperson. And that is very simply that the Congress party has a problem sometimes in being able to advocate the right policies when those right policies are being advocated by the wrong people for the wrong reasons. So in other words, you may see a lot of merit in saying triple talaq is bad and should be knocked out, but when you know it's being pushed by a particular political party for a particular political agenda, you feel that by supporting it, you're simply playing along with somebody else's game. And therefore, you don't actually express what you feel. It's not at all surprising that Rahul Gandhi was one of the first people to express support for the Supreme Court judgment the moment it came out, and did so unabashedly and without any hesitation, that he thought this was a right judgment and that triple talaq had to go in the interest of women's rights. I mean, most Congress people have always believed this, but we hesitated to say it for fear of sounding as if we were playing into the BJP's hands. Let's face it, politics is politics. And this is going to be a bit of a challenge for us if and when the BJP seizes on the right issues for the wrong reasons in the future.